generally speaking, I'll ask for questions and comments at the end.
Okay. And as I said, there are some staff members who may have to leave early. If you have questions and would like Dr. DiGiulio to answer them, you can leave them in the chat and we'll try to address them at the end if time is available. So I want to thank you all for coming today to this faculty presentation by Dr. Stephen DiGiulio. Dr. DiGiulio is on the faculty here at Santa Fe Community College and is professor of English education and TESOL. He's been a college faculty member and school teacher in the United States, Mexico, and India. He holds a PhD in critical pedagogy and bilingualism and an MA in teaching English to speakers of other languages. As we've said, please use the chat to ask questions at the end. If the group is small and we'll just get a feel for how things are, we might be able to have people turn on their mics and ask questions that way. So please help me welcome Dr. Stephen DiGiulio.
Thank you, Val. Hello, everyone. I'd like to address the problem of schools and schooling, which is sometimes very controversial. So if your blood pressure rises, be cool, think of your comments and questions, and we will also have some interaction here. You'll notice right here on the title screen, I use two different words, school and education. And I'll introduce myself a little later also. Education is life. Oops, already. Okay. Education is the way we learn from our environment. We don't need teachers, we don't need schools. And you can't really stop people from learning, especially kids. You can slow them down, however. School, on the other hand, I'm looking at as a social structure, a social organization, and one of the largest in the world. When you think of all those kids and all those teachers and all their ancillary folks, it's one of the largest parts of our society. And I think one of the reasons people are so confused and frustrated dealing with schools is because they don't see it as part of a whole. You can't really understand schools unless you also look at other parts of the society, like the medical system, like the military, like the system for producing and distributing things, like the government system. Unless we address all of those somehow, we're going to be left out. And we have this frustrating history in terms of schooling, year after year after year, so many innovations and new products and new reforms, and the needle doesn't budge. In fact, a lot of reliable testing shows we're doing more poorly than we were 50 years ago. So first, I want to take a look at where I think we should go. A lot of the problems, not only in schooling, has to do with the prevalence of magical thinking. One quick example is people think that memorizing leads to understanding. It doesn't. Memorizing may help a little bit in learning, but memorizing leads to forgetting. And so what I want to focus on today is, can we think about learning in a scientific way, which is actually, how do people learn things? How did we learn our first language when we were babies and we didn't even know what a language was? How can we learn to quantize the world and work with numbers? Multicultural confusion. Well, if you pay any attention to the news, we're in a mess. There are Muslims and Christians and immigrants and old residents and ranchers and trans people and everything else. But the confusion is from fear. We all have multiple identities, of course. And if we're afraid to let go of them, we're stuck. And that leads to violence. What we do in our program here, our alternative teacher licensing program, is try to help people develop ways to create a space in the classroom, an intercultural free space where students can learn from each other. If you think of your own schooling, you probably agree you learn more from your peers than from your teachers in a lot of ways. Social violence, I won't press on. Sorry, my finger is clicking things here. But if we're going to reduce the violence, we have to start where we are. So as a focus, I have two statements I want to show as a focus for today. Children and youth are the spear point of cultural evolution. They can lead us out of the dead end of coloniality if we free them from the discipline and punishment of systemic schooling. And you know, I want to be clear. Education takes place in schools. Teachers are wonderful people. I've been teaching learners and teachers since the 70s. But the system presents a lot of serious problems. In fact, half the teachers who begin quit after a year or two, frustrated by dealing with a system which they feel and they see is really not suitable. It prevents a lot of learning. So if you think of language, you know, once people get to be middle-aged, they usually notice that the young people are talking in a different way, almost a different language, right? Children come into the world and they learn creatively. All learning is creative. And that means they change things. They change the language and they change other aspects of the culture. They learn to grow up under different conditions. And if we stifle their learning through wrong-headed schooling, we're in trouble, because the corollary of this is probably my thesis today, is that only children who continue to learn lifelong can mature into elders, the kind of elders we need to guide us through these dangerous times. And if I make a broad statement and say that school disables the learning ability of many children, just sit with that for a little bit and we may find out there's some truth in it, especially if so much of schooling is based on magical thinking. You're just lucky you don't have your whole life looming in front of you. You know, I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I see this. I think if I were 18 today, I would be terrified. Just take a look around. What's happening? Where are we going? We certainly don't seem to be going in the direction that I'm pointing us. So I have a couple of focus questions with some answers I'll try to substantiate. Why do indigenous peoples respect and revere their elders? Well, I think there's a technical, a scientific answer, because the elders have been learning their whole life long, nothing to stop them. They may have never been to school. And so they have the perspective that can help younger people. How does one persist on a learning path lifelong? Well, just do it. I hope you're all doing it and promote this. When we get stuck, we're in trouble if we don't keep learning. So exactly how does the structure of mass schooling worldwide harm children and youth? And how does this affect healthy cultural evolution? So I'm going to tell a story to start with as a kind of self-introduction. Stories, of course, are false. There are no stories in the world. We make up stories in order to understand things. They're extremely valuable and important unless we think they're the truth. And then we have a basis for violence and war. My story is better than your story. Just like my cultural identity is better than yours. So now I'm standing in a franchise bookstore with my son, our son, who was then just at that developmental age when he was more comfortable on all fours, but he also could walk. So once in a while, he would get up and walk. Sometimes it would work out. Sometimes it wouldn't work out very well. And he was working on it. So I noticed that there was another little boy, exactly the same size and shape. They were very near each other. And an important part of this story is our son has beautiful black skin and beautiful black curly hair. And this other boy had beautiful white skin and beautiful blonde hair. And they were very near each other. And you know, children that age are not sociable. They're still learning to use their limbs to understand all this blah, blah, blah around them and focus on their senses. But the two boys at exactly the same moment became aware of each other, and they turned face to face, very close. And I could see both faces. I could see the look of recognition. Here is a fellow, here is a friend, here is a colleague. And they had the same idea at the same moment. You know, in our globalized world, we're not supposed to talk about a sixth sense, but we all experience it. At the same moment, they had the same idea. They threw open their arms wide and grabbed each other in a big hug. And because they're a little unsure on their feet, you know, they wobbled and then they toppled and then they went down, but they didn't let go. They went down as a unit. And then they were back on all fours and crawled away, each in their own direction. And on my face was an appreciation of this very beautiful sight, this profoundly beautiful experience. And yet there was a discordant note. And as I looked, I saw coming around the corner of the bookshelves, a young man. I'm grandfather's age to our son. And he was obviously the young father to this little blonde boy. And the look on his face, he was struggling to smile and give an approving look, but he wasn't succeeding. There was some kind of conflict in there. And then I felt a power. And around the same corner came the woman who was obviously his mother. She didn't try to smile. She had that ugly, icy expression on her face of people who feel they're so privileged, others are not intelligent enough to understand what they're thinking and feeling. And her message was loud and clear, even though she didn't say a word. Son, get my beautiful little grandson, my beautiful little blonde grandson, away from that dirty little black boy. The young father hung his head, picked up the baby, and as if he were being led on a leash, walked away. And I'm sharing this because we have to understand where hatred, where violence comes from. How can it be after centuries we're still at war with one another, group against group, domestic violence, political violence, all kinds of violence, criminal violence, and the hatreds that move people. And I am certain, I don't know if you share this, that no child is born in this world racist or bigoted or sexist. They have to learn all that. and how do they learn it? So my focus is particularly how children learn the bad things in school. Of course, a lot of it comes from parents. That was a family scene of the transmission of white supremacy and racist attitudes, mother to father, hopefully not to grandson, but we don't know that age, what babies are aware of and how they pick up things. So let's move ahead a little bit. How do we organize our societies? Well, our deep ancestors lived in communities, call them tribes, call them villages, governed by consensus. And they didn't have anything like school. About half their populations were young people and children who participated in the life of the community. And yet, as we developed agriculture and fixed habitations, we started to have family-controlled societies. Children socialized by their parents, by their family members. School and community, not as important. And today, you don't have to agree with this, but really, we are ungoverned. We have such a competitive society where children are socialized by schools to go out and live on their own and compete. Take a minute and think of the most successful schools on earth. Let's say the dozen finest universities and the 20 secondary universities that have all the facilities, all the laboratories and libraries and support staff and money that they need. They graduate hundreds, thousands of people who have acquired very specialized skills and knowledge, right? That's, by conventional standards, the standard of education. But what do they do when they graduate? Well, there's such a competitive aspect to their schooling. They don't learn the empathy to understand other people. They don't learn the ethics to put their own interests last and the interests of the community and the family first. And what do? They're out on their own with their fancy degrees and their knowledge and skills. And overwhelmingly, they find a nice, comfortable niche for themselves in the system that's destroying our world. And that's the most successful part of our education system. So I want to sketch a little bit before I get into some of the details of a scientific approach to learning. I want to just sketch what I call the 5 rules of school. So it's a mental experiment. Think of yourself as a teacher in the early grades, early in the morning. And what do you say? It's time to start, and they're the children. Well, the first thing you say is, come in. And if you're having a bad day, you might say, get in here. But normally you say, come in, little darlings. How are you? Joaquin. Oh, Susanna, that's a beautiful shirt you're wearing. But unpack that. What does that mean? Come into my classroom. What's the obverse of that? And what it is leave your mother behind, leave your family behind, leave your cousins and siblings and neighbors and community behind. Leave the natural world behind, the mountains and oceans and forests. Come into my classroom and I will teach you about the world. Leave it behind. Don't use your own senses, your own actions to learn about the world. And what do I have, the teacher? I have curriculum, which is what some people say they should learn. I have instruction how they're to learn it in a sterilized room in a mean little building with not much ventilation. Come in, leave the world behind, and I'll teach you about the world. And the second rule is sit down. And I won't belabor this, but we know, the doctors all tell us, sitting down for long hours makes people sick and stupid, to put it bluntly, right? You can't breathe freely. You can't move freely in a chair. And your blood is not oxygenated, but it doesn't matter because it pools in the feet. And this is how we expect children or anyone to learn in this state. And, you know, I've been in schools my whole career. All the books tell teachers to get your learners up and moving and active. Learning is active. But if you go into schools and just walk down the corridor, overwhelmingly, children of all ages are just sitting in chairs. Think of the 15-year-olds alive. Their whole world is changing. They're locked in a room with other 15-year-olds going through similar things. An hour of history, ring a bell. An hour of math, ring a bell. Who thought of this inhuman and dehumanizing system? The structure of the system is so much in contra to the way we actually learn things. Come in, sit down, be quiet. Have you ever seen a little child alone, just chatting away to the air, maybe with a toy or without, right? What are they doing? They're expressing themselves, they're learning, they're using the language, they're inventing their stories, right? When we say, be quiet, we're saying to our students, stop expressing yourself, right? Become passive physically, become passive emotionally, and listen to me. It's almost like saying, stop thinking. You know, one of my teacher students who had never taught before, has never taught yet. He's in his 30s, he's done a lot of things, and he wants to do something that's worthwhile and help the kids in schools. He suddenly interrupted the class and said, excuse me, professor, are you saying that students don't have to listen to their teachers? And, you know, trying not to smile too much, I said,
Technology Service Desk.
I said, you know,
Technology
George,
Service.
just a few minutes ago, you interrupted Marianne's presentation and said, excuse me, I missed what you were saying. I was thinking of something else. Could you repeat that? And I hope that sunk in a little bit. Schooling puts children and youth in a situation where it's quite difficult to learn. And so many of them fall into what scholars call the school to prison pipeline, because they're smart, they're creative, they're bored, they rebel, and that gets them into more trouble. And then, of course, the fifth rule is do what I say. Oh boy. Teachers try not to be dictators. They don't have to be dictators. But the rule of the school is come in, do your lessons, take your tests, and we'll stamp you. So how do people actually learn things? Now, let me throw in a bit of educational history. When I was an undergraduate, there was a movement in America known as the free school movement. From about 67 to 72, all over the country, people took notice. Dozens of books had come out in previous decades about the harm that schools do to many children. And more than 800 groups got together, took kids out of schools and started their own free schools. Most of them were gone within a couple of years because they didn't have an alternative. There are some alternatives, which I'll get to, right? but they just faded away. I could have gotten involved in that, but I didn't. I had the great good luck. One of my professors introduced me to Caleb Gattegno, originally Egyptian. He was a chemist and then a mathematician. And when he started to teach math, he realized he understood the math, but he had no idea how others could reach that place of understanding. And he started working on this, what he calls the science of education. In Ethiopia, on a project of literacy, he realized that language is algebraic. A few sounds make up an unlimited number of words, and words make up an unlimited number of sentences. All our language is creative. We never recycle sentences, except, hi, how are you? Where's the restroom? And so on. And he had the idea of hooking up another sense and coloring the sounds so that learners could see them. A simple but brilliant idea. So I'm not going to spend much time on this. It's not for today, but this is a picture of the English language. And almost no one who speaks English has any idea of what the sounds are. The vowels are on the top, the consonants are on the bottom, but learners love it. And I've seen classes full of 5- and 6-year-olds totally reading and writing because it's so interesting. It's so much fun to play with the sounds and put them together. This is not whole word approach. This is not phonics approach. This is a scientific approach. If you've ever seen the International Phonetic Alphabet, this is what it looks like. I don't teach learners this, but I teach it to teachers so they can help the learners. And now, oh my goodness, the green says ooh. How many words have ooh in them? Well, here's Sue. Oops, where do we go here? Here's Sue, who has boots, who has 2 boots, who has blue boots. So you can get an idea that play is the way we learn, experimenting with things, trying them out, making mistakes. In school, overwhelmingly, teachers introduce new material without giving students time to play with it and actually digest it. It's a crime. Here are the consonants. Did you have any idea there were so many different ways to spell the consonants in English? It breaks my heart when I see an early grade teacher hold up a picture of a household feline with C-A-T there in large letters and say, okay, children, repeat after me. Ka-a-ta, a little bit faster. Ka-a-ta, ka-a-ta. In a million years, you'll never get cat out of ka-a-ta. And why a picture? Pictures have nothing to do with literacy. It could be a kitten, it could be a cat, it could be my favorite uncle's pet Beauregard. And, when kids get the right input, they put things together. They learned their first language or languages with no instruction at all. And this just makes it clear and accessible. Oops. And here are some words. Beautiful. They're attractive. They're fun to play with. Jiddu Krishnamurti, I had a great opportunity to hear him speak several times, one of the great philosophers of 20th century. And he wrote a lot about education, not much about schooling. Here he is, several places in the world started schools based on his approach to learning. Here he is with some students in one of the schools. It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Let's look at our healthcare system for a minute. You know, we all know Americans spend a lot more on medical care than any other country. And we are certainly not healthier than any other country. And people complain about, you know, greed, the insurance companies, the doctors, the excess technology. But what's the problem? The problem is we have a very unhealthy lifestyle. When's the last time you went somewhere using your two legs? Maybe you can't remember it. I mean, if you're a hiker like me, you love to go out and walk. It is the best thing probably you can do for general health. But instead of walking, we go around like headless chickens, rushing around in these cars that are propelled by little explosions, polluting the air and atrophying our legs. So the problem does not lie in money or corruption. And education is quite like healthcare. We spend more per child on education in this country than any other country. And you probably are sick of every once in a while reading articles about how we compare in the results, right? Amanda Ripley has a wonderful presentation called Ask the Kids, where she compares in completely conventional terms the results in mathematical understanding among kids in different countries and different states of this country. Well, we don't have any state who's in the top 20% and only one that's in the top 40%. And it's not money that's the problem, right? It's the structure. If we had some science. And the second quote speaks to that. Freedom from desire for an answer is essential to the understanding of a problem. Professors come into schools with their programs and their products and the salespeople from the publishers. But unless we accept the problem, unless we embrace it, unless we live with it, we don't have an idea what it is or an idea what to do about it. And one more quote from Krishnamurti. There's no end to education. It's not that you read a book, pass an exam, finish, and you are finished with education. The whole of life, from the moment you're born to the moment you die, is a process of learning. We can't stop that. And yet, why is it that our children learn to be bigots, learn to be hateful, learn to be competitive and try to be first, learn to be jealous? These are the questions that if our schools don't address, I'm not sure who is going to address them. So here's a book I'm not selling, but I wrote an introduction. This is a professor I studied with in India at Rabindranath Tagore's university. And for the second edition, I wrote an introduction, which I put in the chat if you're interested. The book is very good, but it's specialized. You may recommend it to a library if you like. In my introduction, I try to convey in contemporary terms what Tagore has to say. For 40 years, he ran schools and a university. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature and used that money to open up, I think, the first world university with scholars and students from the Far East, from Europe, from the Americas. That's one of the classrooms today. I like to think of it as my classroom because I spent about 1.5 years on the campus. This is Tagore with his 2 daughters. He was one of the most important voices in the independence movement in India to get rid of the British colonial power. And yet when his own children started learning, he really stepped back from politics. And that's when he started opening schools. And there on the right, he's with a little learner. I just threw this in for fun. Tagore was one of the most sought after international personalities and intellectuals. He traveled east-west to many countries, Argentina, all over Europe, and etc., several times to this country. What I have following this on the slides are a few of Tagore's paintings, which I might want to just scroll through, but I'd like to respond to your comments and questions.
So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat or turn on your microphone and can ask your question. There's one question from the chat so far, more of a discussion point perhaps. This person would argue that children are now being socialized by social media and what they watch on screens.
Of course, that's extremely true and extremely dangerous. You know, if your memory goes back to when television first came in, people were ecstatic. They said, oh, now people will learn everything about the world. This will be such a wonderful invention. And the drivel that's broadcast on television and through social media is just like the people who broadcast it. But it is powerful, and the way it's attractive and the way it becomes addictive is very dangerous. And the way our finances support it and funnel money away from working people into the people that produce these products, products meaning the devices and also the content, which is so attractive and so much against the interests of all of us. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it's certainly true that social media is not having a very positive effect. It has some positive uses, of course, just like there are wonderful cinematic art. There are some wonderful shows on television.
So there's another question. Sometimes school is an opportunity for some kids to see beyond their families and their situation. Can you talk about the value of that when it happens?
Well, that is extremely valuable, and it's successful in some cases. But there's a negative side to that also. When someone comes from a less privileged home situation into a school, they're often ignored. And how do they feel about that? You know, I was outside this country for quite a few years. And when I came back and started teaching college in this country, I noticed something strange. I had African American students, and by their behavior, it seemed like they had never been asked questions before. They had never been included in the classroom dialogue. And I talked to them, and I saw over a series of semesters what my fellow faculty were doing. And that in fact, they had been just allowed to sit in a corner because of this profound prejudice. And so, you know, I've also taught in schools where all the students were African American, which is a totally different dynamic. But, and sometimes advancing in education causes problems in families because the family might reject the person, let's say, who's going to college and trying to get that kind of social recognition. What we try and teach in our program is to have teachers aware of these socioeconomic parameters as well as the, emotional and cognitive aspects of learning, and to open up so students learn from each other, regardless of the background and where they come from.
Thank you. There's a bit of a discussion here about somebody commented adoption of education through virtual classes is distressing, and then another participant said the technical cultural divide in schools has turned into a barrier between students and teachers. Would you like to comment on that?
I'm not sure I got it completely. If you're talking about the digital divide, that has become much more serious during this COVID move to more and more online education. And, some of the students who need their teachers the most have dropped out of the system. I'm not sure the questioner was asking from that, but you can, open your mic and just speak up and talk to me. Luigi.
Yes, Stephen. I'm living in Italy, in Tuscany, and I'm teaching online to many elementary schools in my community. And basically, I'm retired, but I'm giving my free time. And I had also met and studied with Gattegno in the past, and most of my teaching is done through the silent way. What I'm noticing in schools, especially here, is of this cultural divide where young students are so advanced technologically with their iPods or their computers or whatever they have, and yet teachers in the classroom, they're still seating students as they were in the 1800s. They're still reading books from page 1 to page 99. Language is taught first on page 1, we pass page 1, we go to page 2. You do the exercise and you go to page 3. And they're all complaining that they have difficulties in controlling their students. I started teaching online with the silent way. I have more than 25, 30 students online for more than 2 hours per class, and not one wants to get up or go to the bathroom or have a recess. And we're all talking technologically. So this divide that I'm referring to is, yes, the teachers are trying, but some just are not technologically there. The divide is there. I don't know if you can, expand on that, Stephen.
Thank you, Luigi. And just to be clear, what he's referring to as the silent way is Gattegno's approach for language acquisition, which is used in many places. And, when the science is there, when students are actually learning, actually engaged in the process of learning, which is the most engaging process that human beings can engage in, they don't have short attention spans. They don't get distracted by cell phones or by anything else. And the technology is absolutely not necessary for this. It's hard to say, but when you have a class and it's 2 hours or more, and students forget the time and you run over just because there's nothing else they want to do, that means you're a successful teacher. They're successful learners. Even if you're just watching them learn, all you have to do is turn them loose with the right elements, like the elements of the sounds and the letters I showed you so briefly. They'll put it together and start reading things. But when control is an issue, then you have social conditioning as the primary motivation. And many teachers, unfortunately, are forced out of the profession because they fight with the students to control. We can't control other human beings, right? We can enter that culturally free intercultural space, interpersonal space with them and share experiences.
I have a question for you. Do you have an example of a school, or if not an entire school, a program that's occurring in New Mexico that might set a good example for education?
You know, that is a very interesting question. And we could have gone in a different direction and looked at schools influenced by Maria Montessori, looked at the Waldorf schools. Tagore School, we touched on just a little bit. He had schools and a university. Gattegno never accepted anyone's proposal to start a school because he was interested in the learning process. And he worked with thousands and thousands of teachers from all over the world. And, you know, you can't start a school without a good amount of money and resources of all kinds. And unless it's an organic part of the community, let me give you an example. In my years of teaching teachers, with almost every group, at some point, I asked them to share their experiences of their own schooling. And I never got the following answer. Oh, school, wow. I couldn't wait to get up in the morning and go to school. We learned to speak and understand several foreign languages. We learned to make food and grow food. We learned to do scientific research. We went into the town. We learned how the city government works. We went into the mountains and the oceans, and we never stopped learning. And my audience, don't forget, is entirely positive. They are people who want to go into teaching as a profession. They're very positive towards school and schooling and education. And yet, if you think children don't deserve that kind of experience, that's a European idea, which probably dates back to the so-called Enlightenment, which really was a kind of dark age when children were considered to be wild and had to be tamed, or you were told to break the child's spirit. And that's still the dominant situation in schools. Security and discipline in schools is what's taken most seriously. And, you know, we have charter schools. Some of them are okay. Some of them might be excellent. Some public schools are excellent. Some private schools are excellent. But there's not a formula that remains. So you have to be open and look for what makes sense. And especially with your own children in school, you have to be careful that they don't get sidetracked. Even just 1 year with a wrong teacher can be a mistake in a child's life. So no, I don't have any particular institution that I can recommend. We have to make them.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? You please feel free to turn on your mic and ask a question.
The Zoom silences are
Yeah,
a little hard to deal with.
they are.
I haven't been changing the screen either.
The images have been great.
Christine.
Stephen, you and I went to school together,
Sure.
and we had some interesting experiences. Yet somehow you survived. In your talk about what made a positive difference and actually made you along the.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I missed a couple of words there, but I think I got the gist of it. And I did not get much out of my high school. I went to high school with Christine in New Jersey. But some of the teachers made a lasting impression on me. You know, when my teachers share their experiences of their own education, almost every one of them names one or two teachers who made a big difference in their life. And that's enough for them to want to go into the profession. My math teacher in high school was such a beautiful person. I just felt happy being in her class 4 years. I also like math, but what I got from her more than the math was poetry, because she snuck in a little poem here and there. Her favorite was E. Cummings. And, you know, so much of the structure of schooling prevents people from getting to know each other. And confining learners into age group cohorts is one of the most damaging. In a natural setting, I was lucky to grow up with cousins and neighbors, and we could go around and play, the kids of different ages, and interact and unsupervised go and do our mischief and learn things. And so much with overpopulation and terribly crowded urban areas, kids don't have a lot of the opportunities that used to sustain them outside of boring, as Luigi says, 18th century teachers who think all they have to do is tell students what someone thinks they need to know.
ML, I see you unmuted yourself. Do you want to speak?
Oh, no.
Okay. Somebody in chat is asking what your thoughts on homeschool are.
Homeschool is tough because another questioner mentioned the advantages of having experiences outside your home. And when we can take advantage of those, that's a wonderful thing. And, I have had quite a number of students over the years who were homeschooled before they get to college. And, it just takes a lot of initiative, time, and resources to do it right. And there is a kind of retrograde movement under the name of homeschooling, which really wants to indoctrinate their children to a specific set of beliefs. I went to Catholic schools, but I don't think I was indoctrinated, or maybe there was an attempt which failed, right? But homeschooling can be done. And especially if a number of parents of kids of different ages work together on it. From my reading, which is not extensive, that's tends to be the most successful kind of homeschooling. It's like expanding the family a little bit and including some formal lessons and some informal lessons.
All right. And we have a chat from Gwen saying nothing without joy. Learning needs to be fun, even at the college level. Curriculum needs to be determined by the interests of the students. We teach Reggio Emilia approach in our iBest early childhood education program at SFCC. Students collaborate online with real world projects, and they can do it in their classroom.
Absolutely. Thank you, whoever that was.
All right. Any other questions for Stephen today? People are thanking you in the chat.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time and interest. And if something occurs to you, I'm happy to hear from you further along the line.
Thank you. Thank you for doing the presentation today. It was really insightful and great to hear your perspective on. Thank you so much.
And thank you for hosting in the library.
Of course.
Arrivederci. Buon